On a February morning in 2002, a woman lay still in a London hospital bed. Her eyes, once described as vivid purple blue and capable of stopping a room mid-sentence, had closed for the final time. She was 71 years old, and she had lived more lives than most people could imagine. Princess Margaret Rose, the younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II, had been many things in her 7 decades. A disappointment at birth, a beloved daughter, a forbidden lover, a scandalous divorcee, a devoted mother, and always, always, the spare. But there was one thing she had been that most people never fully understood. She had been a homeowner, just once in her entire life. Not Kensington Palace, though she lived there for nearly 40 years. Not Clarence House, where she grieved her father. Not any of the grand royal residences that surrounded her from the moment she drew her first breath in a Scottish castle. No. The only property Princess Margaret ever owned sat on a Caribbean headland, 10 acres of tropical paradise on an island most people had never heard of. A place called Mustique, a house called Les Jolies Eaux, beautiful waters. This is the story of that house. But more than that, this is the story of a woman who spent her entire life searching for a place where she could finally, truly be herself. The making of a princess. To understand why one small villa on a remote Caribbean island meant so much to Princess Margaret, we have to go back to the beginning. To a castle in Scotland on an August evening in 1930. Margaret Rose was born at Glamis Castle, the ancestral home of her mother's family, on the 21st of August. It was a momentous occasion in one sense. She was the first major royal to be born in Scotland since Charles I, more than 300 years earlier. The Home Secretary himself traveled north to verify the birth, a tradition dating back centuries. But in another sense, Margaret's arrival was a disappointment. The British public and the royal family had been hoping for a boy. At the time, there were no male heirs to the throne in Margaret's generation. Her older sister Elizabeth was already heir presumptive, and a brother would have changed the succession entirely. Instead, they got another girl. Margaret would spend much of her life grappling with that feeling of being not quite enough, not quite what was wanted, not quite what was needed. For her first 6 years, life was golden. The York family, as they were known then, lived at 145 Piccadilly in London and spent weekends at Royal Lodge in Windsor. Margaret's father, the Duke of York, was devoted to both his daughters, but he had a special soft spot for his younger girl. While Elizabeth was his pride, Margaret was his joy. Elizabeth was serious, conscientious, already showing the steady temperament that would one day make her a beloved monarch. Margaret was something else entirely. She was vivacious, mischievous, talented. She could sing. She could play piano beautifully by the age of 4. She could make her father laugh until tears streamed down his face. And then, in December 1936, everything changed. Her uncle, King Edward VIII, announced he would abdicate the throne to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. The scandal rocked the nation, the empire, the world. Overnight, Margaret's father became King George VI, her sister became heir to the throne, and Margaret became the spare. Second in line, yes, but second in every other way too. The sisters moved into Buckingham Palace. Their education, already unconventional, took divergent paths. Elizabeth received training in constitutional matters, languages, and statecraft. Margaret continued under her mother's supervision, receiving what some later described as a bare-bones education designed to produce nicely behaved young ladies, rather than accomplished women. Margaret was intelligent, whip-smart, some would say. Gore Vidal, who knew her later in life, observed that she was far too intelligent for her station. She devoured books. She asked probing questions. But the system wasn't designed to nurture intellectual princesses. It was designed to produce decorative ones. The war years. When World War II broke out in 1939, there were calls for the young princesses to be evacuated to Canada for their safety. Their mother famously refused. "The children won't go without me," she declared. "I won't leave without the king, and the king will never leave." So the sisters stayed. They spent most of the war at Windsor Castle, relatively safe from the bombs that fell on London. Margaret was only 9 when the war began, 15 when it ended. She spent those formative years largely indoors, protected, sheltered, increasingly restless. Elizabeth found ways to contribute. She trained with the Women's Auxiliary Territorial Service, learning to drive and maintain military vehicles. Margaret was too young for such service. She waited. She practiced piano. She listened to the wireless. She dreamed of the world beyond the castle walls. On VE Day in May 1945, both princesses were allowed to slip out of Buckingham Palace and join the celebrating crowds in the streets. They went unrecognized, anonymous for perhaps the only time in their lives, swept up in the joy and relief of a nation at peace. For Margaret, it must have felt like a glimpse of freedom, a taste of what normal life might be like. But normal life was not to be her destiny. The first heartbreak. In 1947, the royal family embarked on a 3-month tour of South Africa. It was Margaret's first major trip abroad, and she was accompanied by a young Royal Air Force officer who served as her father's equerry. His name was Peter Townsend. Townsend was handsome, accomplished, and a decorated war hero. He had flown Hurricanes during the Battle of Britain, shooting down at least 11 enemy aircraft. He was also married with 2 young sons. Margaret later told friends that she fell in love with him during those long days in South Africa. "We rode together every morning in that wonderful country, in marvelous weather," she recalled. "That's when I really fell in love with him." She was 16 years old. Their connection deepened over the following years, though neither acknowledged it openly. In 1952, 2 things happened that would change everything. Margaret's beloved father died of lung cancer in February, devastating her. And later that year, Peter Townsend's marriage ended when his wife left him for another man. In the aftermath of her father's death, Margaret turned to Townsend for comfort. He was a familiar face, a trusted presence, someone who understood the Byzantine world of the palace. Their friendship became something more. By the end of 1952, they were in love. There was just one problem. Townsend was divorced. And in 1950s Britain, that mattered. It mattered enormously. The Church of England did not permit divorced people to remarry while their former spouse was still living. And the head of the Church of England was Margaret's sister, Queen Elizabeth II. To marry Townsend, Margaret would need the Queen's permission, and that permission would not come. Their secret was exposed at Elizabeth's coronation in June 1953. A journalist noticed Margaret picking a piece of lint off Townsend's uniform. It was an intimate gesture, a small moment of tenderness that revealed everything. Within days, the story was on front pages around the world. What followed was years of agony. Margaret was asked to wait until she turned 25, when she would no longer need the Queen's permission to marry. But when that birthday came and went, the government made clear that if she married Townsend, she would be stripped of her royal privileges, her income, and her place in the line of succession. On October 31st, 1955, Margaret released a statement. I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend, she wrote, mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth. I have decided to put these considerations before any others. She was 25 years old. She had chosen duty over love, and something inside her broke. The swinging princess. The years that followed were ones of reinvention. If duty had demanded she give up Townsend, then Margaret would find other ways to express herself, ways that shocked the establishment and delighted the gossip columnists. She threw herself into London's social scene with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Night after night, she could be found in the clubs of Mayfair, dancing until dawn, drinking champagne, surrounded by an ever-changing cast of admirers. She became famous for her glamour, her wit, her sharp tongue, and her refusal to go home before the sun came up. The press dubbed her circle the Margaret Set, a group of aristocratic young things who embodied everything that was new and exciting about post-war Britain. The Margaret Set was unlike anything the royal family had seen before. While Elizabeth settled into her role as the steady, dependable queen, Margaret became the face of a different kind of royalty, one that went to nightclubs, one that wore daring fashions, one that dated openly and frequently and never seemed to care what anyone thought. Her 18-inch waist became famous. Her vivid blue eyes stopped men in their tracks. Her ability to make cutting remarks, delivered with a smile that somehow made them more devastating, became legendary. She could be cruel. She could reduce grown men to stammering embarrassment with a single raised eyebrow, but she could also be captivating. When Margaret decided to charm someone, they stayed charmed. She was witty, well-read despite her limited formal education, and genuinely interested in the arts in a way that few royals had been. She loved ballet, she adored theater. She could discuss music with genuine knowledge and passion. She dated a string of eligible bachelors: Lord Blandford, the Marquis of Blandford, Johnny Dalkeith, Billy Wallace, Colin Tennant. The newspapers tracked her every move, speculating endlessly about which one might become her husband. She developed a reputation for extravagance. Her morning routine allegedly began with breakfast in bed, accompanied by a vodka pick-me-up and a 2-hour bath. She smoked constantly, a habit she would never break. She stayed out until the small hours, then slept until noon. But beneath the glamour was a woman in pain. Friends noticed her hands sometimes trembled. Her laughter could turn brittle. The life of the party was, in private moments, deeply unhappy. Then, in 1958, she met someone new. His name was Anthony Armstrong Jones, and he was everything the establishment didn't expect. He was a photographer, not an aristocrat, a professional, not a gentleman of leisure. His parents were divorced, a scandal in those days. He ran his own studio in Pimlico, lived in a basement flat, and moved in circles that had nothing to do with royal tradition. Armstrong Jones was known for his talent. He had photographed everyone from showgirls to duchesses, bringing a fresh eye and a modern sensibility to portraiture. When he was commissioned to photograph Princess Margaret, something clicked between them immediately. He was artistic, unconventional, and utterly charming in a way that differed completely from the titled suitors who had pursued Margaret for years. He could be difficult, temperamental, demanding. But he was also creative, sensitive, and capable of seeing Margaret in a way that no one else seemed to manage. Their courtship was conducted in secret, which suited Margaret perfectly. After years of her love life being dissected in public, she relished having something private. They met at dinner parties hosted by mutual friends. He photographed her repeatedly, capturing a warmth and vulnerability that previous portraits had missed. They fell deeply, genuinely in love. The relationship developed away from the cameras that had documented Margaret's every previous romance. She would slip out of official engagements to meet him. He would photograph her in settings far removed from the formal portraits that usually captured royalty. They built something real, something private, something that belonged only to them. When their engagement was announced in February 1960, the press was stunned. They had suspected nothing. For once, Margaret had managed to keep her secrets. The world's most watched unmarried woman had conducted an entire romance without a single photographer catching them together. Their wedding on May 6, 1960, was a global event. 300 million people watched the ceremony on television, making it the most watched broadcast in history at that time. Westminster Abbey was filled with flowers and music. Margaret wore a dress by Norman Hartnell and the Poltimore tiara, a magnificent piece she had chosen herself and purchased at auction rather than borrowing from the royal collection. Princess Anne, then just 9 years old, was among the bridesmaids. The Duke of Edinburgh gave Margaret away. The Archbishop of Canterbury officiated. And when Margaret walked down the aisle on her brother-in-law's arm, she was finally a bride. The honeymoon that followed would take Margaret to the Caribbean for the first time, aboard the royal yacht Britannia. It was during this trip that she would first see Mustique and first set foot on the land that would one day become Les Jolies Eaux. And as a wedding gift, she received something that would change her life. The gift of an island. Colin Tennant was one of Margaret's oldest friends. They had been romantically linked in the past, though nothing serious had come of it. Tennant was eccentric, mercurial, prone to wild enthusiasms and dramatic gestures. 2 years earlier, he had done something that seemed mad even by his standards. He had bought an entire island. Mustique was a tiny speck in the Caribbean, 3 miles long and 1.5 miles wide. It had no roads, no running water, no electricity, no dock. Just jungle, scrub, poisonous manchineal trees, and millions of mosquitoes. Tennant had paid £45,000 for it without ever setting foot there. The island had a history, though not a grand one. It had once been a sugar plantation, worked by enslaved people who cultivated the land until the economics of sugar production shifted elsewhere. By the time Tennant bought it, Mustique was essentially abandoned. A handful of local residents lived in corrugated tin shacks, fishing and farming on a subsistence level. Tennant's original plan was to grow cotton. He would create a plantation, employ the local people, and turn a profit on this obscure Caribbean rock. It was the kind of romantic notion that appealed to him, the aristocrat playing at agriculture in the tropics. The cotton venture failed almost immediately. The soil was wrong. The climate was challenging. The logistics of getting anything to or from such a remote location were nightmarish. Tennant was left with an island he couldn't develop and couldn't sell. His wife Anne thought he had lost his mind. "Colin," she said when she first saw it, "this is sheer madness." But Tennant had a second vision, one that would prove far more successful. If he couldn't farm Mustique, he would develop it as an exclusive retreat. A private paradise for people who had everything except privacy. A place so remote, so difficult to reach, that only the truly wealthy and well-connected would bother. In 1968, he formed the Mustique Company. He began selling plots to carefully selected buyers. He established rules that protected the island's character, limiting development and ensuring that whatever was built would harmonize with the natural beauty. And he made one brilliant marketing decision that would define Mustique's image for the next 50 years. He gave land to Princess Margaret. When Margaret married, Tennant faced a problem. He had forgotten to buy a wedding gift. So he improvised. He offered her 10 acres of land on Mustique, a plot on a headland at the southern tip of the island, overlooking the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, a place called Jolies. According to legend, he showed her a map and asked what she would prefer, a wrapped gift or land on Mustique. She chose the land. It was the only property she would ever own, the only square inch in the world that truly belonged to her. Building a dream. For 8 years, the land sat untouched. Margaret's marriage consumed her attention. She and Tony, as Lord Snowdon was known, set about creating their own world at Kensington Palace. Apartment 1A was a wreck when they received it. The palace had been damaged during the Blitz and never properly restored. Rising damp had destroyed the floors. The plumbing dated from a previous century. The heating was virtually non-existent, which in a London winter meant genuine physical misery. Windows rattled in their frames. Paint peeled from the walls. Princess Marina, the Duchess of Kent, who lived in the adjacent apartment, watched the young couple arrive with undisguised skepticism. She had already lost half her own apartment when it was subdivided to create 1A. Now she would have to endure years of construction noise as Margaret and Tony transformed their new home. The budget was strict. In 1960, Kensington Palace fell under the Ministry of Works, which meant government oversight of every penny spent. The final cost came to £85,000, a significant sum but hardly extravagant by royal standards. Margaret complained bitterly about the restrictions, arguing that she and Tony should be allowed to create something worthy of a princess. What they created was revolutionary. Working with theatrical designer Carl Toms, who had trained under Tony's uncle Oliver Messel, the couple gutted the entire interior. By 1962, everything had been stripped out. The floors were removed to deal with decades of rising damp. The electrical systems were replaced, the plumbing was modernized, and then the real work began. Margaret threw herself into every decision. The color palette was bold by royal standards, featuring her beloved pink and kingfisher blue alongside modern neutrals. The kitchen was fitted with formica countertops and teak cabinets, materials that would have been unthinkable in a royal residence just a generation earlier. Tony insisted on a darkroom where he could develop his photographs, a working space within the heart of the palace. The entrance hall featured black and white checkerboard tiles designed by Carl Toms, a theatrical touch that set the tone for everything that followed. In the drawing room, orange drapery caused whispers among the traditionalists. Was this really how a princess should live? Shouldn't there be more guilt, more formality, more respect for precedent? Margaret and Tony didn't care. They were creating a home for a new era, and when they finally moved in on March 4th, 1963, the apartment became the most fashionable address in London. The parties at Kensington Palace entered legend almost immediately. Margaret's guest lists mixed royalty with rock stars, aristocrats with artists, politicians with performers. Rudolf Nureyev danced in the drawing room, his extraordinary talent displayed for a private audience of perhaps 20 people. Elizabeth Taylor held court, her violet eyes as famous as Margaret's blue ones. Peter Sellers performed impromptu comedy routines that had guests crying with laughter. The Beatles came. The Rolling Stones came. Mary Quant came and discussed how fashion was democratizing Britain. Vidal Sassoon came and talked about how his geometric haircuts were revolutionizing beauty. Photographers, designers, writers, musicians all found themselves summoned to Kensington Palace for evenings that stretched until dawn. It was the swinging 60s, and nowhere swung harder than apartment 1A. Margaret had created something unprecedented, a royal residence that felt genuinely contemporary, genuinely exciting, genuinely alive. But even as she celebrated in her new home, Margaret knew the truth. The apartment didn't belong to her. It belonged to the crown, like everything else in her life. The jewels she wore, the cars she rode in, the staff who served her. Everything was borrowed, allocated, on loan from an institution that could take it all away. Mustique was different. Mustique was hers. In 1968, with her marriage showing signs of strain, Margaret contacted Colin Tennant. "Is it true?" she asked. "Did you really mean it about the land? And does it come with a house?" Tennant confirmed the gift was genuine, but there was no house. If Margaret wanted one, she would have to build it herself. She decided to do exactly that, the architect of dreams. Oliver Messel was one of the most celebrated theatrical designers of his generation. He had created sets and costumes for the Royal Opera House, for Broadway, for Hollywood. His work was characterized by fantasy, romance, and an almost magical quality that transported audiences to other worlds. He was also Tony Armstrong Jones's uncle, and by the late 1960s, he had relocated permanently to the Caribbean, settling in Barbados after health problems made transatlantic travel impossible. Tennant suggested Messel for the Mustique project. It was inspired. Messel understood spectacle, he understood how to create atmosphere, and he understood the Caribbean in a way that no London architect could. Margaret gave him a brief that was deceptively simple. She wanted a house that felt nothing like the grandeur she was used to, a place where she could escape the trappings of royalty. A home, not a palace. Messel delivered something extraordinary. He designed a low-slung villa in what he called a neo-Georgian style, but with distinctly Caribbean elements. The roof was pitched steeply to withstand hurricanes and catch rainwater, which was precious on an island with no natural springs. The floors were decorated Caribbean ceramic tiles. The furniture included bamboo pieces that Margaret imported from London. The construction process was an adventure in itself. Everything had to be brought to the island by boat. There was no proper harbor, so supplies were offloaded onto smaller vessels and rowed to shore. Workers came from neighboring islands, attracted by wages that were generous by local standards. The building rose slowly, constrained by weather, logistics, and the sheer difficulty of constructing anything on such a remote site. Margaret visited repeatedly during the construction years. Unlike at Kensington Palace, where she had complained about budget restrictions and government oversight, here she accepted the limitations with surprising grace. She stayed in basic accommodations, sometimes just tents or temporary structures. She ate what was available, often tinned food supplemented by fish that local fishermen caught that day. She showered under a bucket of water hung from a tree, the same as everyone else working on the site. Friends who accompanied her on these visits were amazed by the transformation. This was not the demanding princess they knew from London, the one who expected service to be perfect and complained loudly when it wasn't. This was a woman who seemed genuinely happy to rough it, as long as she was making progress on her dream. The house was designed to be intimate rather than grand. Just 5 bedrooms, arranged to maximize views and privacy. A drawing room that opened onto a covered veranda. A dining pavilion that could be used for outdoor entertaining. The whole structure embraced its setting rather than trying to impose formality upon it. The house was open plan and airy, designed to blur the boundaries between inside and outside. Large doors folded back to reveal the gardens and the sea beyond. Coral stone balustrades lined the verandas. A lily pond reflected the tropical sky. Bougainvillea and hibiscus surrounded the building, creating splashes of color against the blue Caribbean backdrop. Inside, Margaret made choices that reflected her personality rather than her position. She hung a portrait of her sister, painted by Pietro Annigoni, in a place of honor. But she also filled the rooms with comfortable furniture, books, records, and the accumulated possessions of a woman who loved beautiful things but didn't need them to be priceless. Most importantly, it was intimate. No grand reception halls, no throne rooms, no echoing corridors designed to intimidate visitors, no staff quarters large enough to house an army of servants. This was a house for living, not for ceremony. A house where Margaret could walk barefoot from bedroom to beach. A house where she could cook if she wanted to, or mix her own drinks, or simply sit in silence and watch the sunset without anyone waiting for instructions. Tennant later observed that Oliver had instilled the essence of the West Indies in a little cottage. It gave Princess Margaret the greatest possible pleasure not to be reminded of the grandeur of what she was. Construction took years. Margaret visited frequently to supervise, staying in basic accommodation and eating tinned food and fresh fish. She showered under a bucket of water hung from a tree, just like everyone else on the island. She never complained. When Les Jolies Eaux was finally completed in 1972, Margaret had something she had never had before, a home of her own. The only place I can relax. What was it about Mustique that captured Margaret so completely? Part of it was simply the beauty. The headland where her house stood offered sweeping views of turquoise water. Tropical gardens surrounded the villa, filled with hibiscus and bougainvillea. A private beach, Jolies Beach, was accessible only to those who knew where to look. But beauty alone doesn't explain the pull Mustique had on her. There were beautiful places all over the world, many of them far more luxurious than this remote island. What Mustique offered was something rarer: freedom. On Mustique, there were no photographers hiding in the bushes, no journalists following her every move, no courtiers monitoring her behavior, no protocol dictating what she could wear, say, or do. Margaret could swim in the sea without worrying about unflattering pictures appearing in the tabloids. She could stay up until dawn without critics tutting about her extravagance. She could invite whoever she wanted without seeking approval. And invite people she did. The guest lists at Les Jolies Eaux read like a who's who of 1970s celebrity. Mick Jagger, who built his own house on the island in a Japanese style. David Bowie, who owned a villa called Britannia Bay House, designed with Indonesian and Scandinavian influences by architect Arne Hasselquist. Musicians, artists, aristocrats, and rogues mixed freely at Margaret's parties. The island developed its own rituals, many of them started by Margaret herself. Beach picnics became a cornerstone of social life. Each villa would stake out a stretch of sand, set up tables with linen and candlelight, grill fresh seafood, and welcome whoever wandered by. The formality that governed Margaret's life in London simply didn't apply here. Basil Charles, a young man from nearby St. Vincent, arrived on Mustique in 1971. He started as a mechanic and bartender, fixing equipment during the early days when electricity was unreliable and mixing drinks at the Cotton House Hotel. A chance encounter with Colin Tennant transformed his life. He perfectly prepared Tennant's preferred rum and coke, and suddenly he was part of the inner circle. Charles befriended Margaret without initially knowing she was royalty. He had no idea what it should be like to meet a royal, he later recalled. He was ignorant of protocol, but she didn't seem to mind. She was a really nice person, he said, and it was kind of wonderful. That kind of encounter was only possible on Mustique. In London, no one approached Margaret without knowing exactly who she was. In London, every interaction was mediated by protocol, by expectation, by the invisible weight of centuries of royal tradition. On Mustique, a bartender could become a friend. Colin Tennant threw legendary events on the island. For his 50th birthday in 1976, he staged a week-long celebration that became the stuff of legend. Guests were transported by chartered yacht. Parties took place on beaches, in villas, and at locations that had been specially prepared for the occasion. The culminating event was billed as a modern Field of the Cloth of Gold, referencing the famous meeting between English and French kings in 1520. Macaroni Beach was sprayed gold. The trees were painted gold. Palm fronds were woven into golden arches. Guests arrived in costumes that might have bankrupted a small nation. Margaret crowned Tenant King of Mustique at the celebration. She wore a gold caftan and matching turban. Bianca Jagger came in a gold-hooped dress with a parasol, looking like Scarlett O'Hara reimagined for a Caribbean fantasy. Mick Jagger wore slashed shirts and cut-off jeans. The photographer Robert Mapplethorpe attended and wrote to his lover that the whole thing was completely mad. It was extravagant, ridiculous, and utterly removed from anything Margaret experienced in her official life. She loved every minute of it. "This is the only place I can relax," she often said, and she meant it. At Les Jolies, Eaux, Margaret revealed a side of herself that the British public rarely saw. She was warm, funny, and surprisingly earthy. She played piano and sang, often ribald songs that made guests blush and laugh. She could be rude, certainly. She was a stickler for protocol even when relaxing, but she was also capable of genuine kindness and connection. Jeanette Cadet, who worked for the Mustique company for decades, remembered Margaret as quite tiny and very fun-loving. She liked nothing more than to sit and drink and sing a ditty at the piano. Basil Charles, a local man who became one of the island's best-known figures, befriended Margaret without initially knowing she was royalty. She was a really nice person, he recalled, and it was kind of wonderful. For Margaret, these relationships were precious. On Mustique, people could see her as a person rather than a princess. They could laugh with her, argue with her, treat her like a human being rather than an institution. It was liberating, and it was addictive. The scandal. But even paradise has its serpents. In 1973, Margaret met a young man named Roddy Llewellyn. He was 25 years old, she was 43. He was a landscape gardener and aspiring singer. She was one of the most famous women in the world. They met through the Tennants at their Scottish estate. Roddy was handsome, charming, and utterly unlike the aristocratic suitors Margaret usually attracted. He was also 17 years her junior. Their relationship developed quietly at first. Roddy visited Les Jolies, Eaux. They spent time together in London. Margaret's marriage to Tony was effectively over by this point, though they remained legally wed and kept up public appearances. Then, in February 1976, disaster struck. A photographer captured images of Margaret and Roddy together on Mustique. They were swimming in the sea, relaxed and intimate. Roddy was wearing Union Jack swimming trunks. Margaret was in a pink bathing suit. When the photographs were published, the scandal exploded. Here was the Queen's sister, still married, cavorting with a man almost young enough to be her son. The tabloids went into a frenzy. Questions were asked in Parliament. Margaret's already fragile public image shattered. Within weeks, Margaret and Tony announced their separation. Their divorce was finalized in 1978, making Margaret the first senior British royal to divorce since Henry VIII more than 400 years earlier. Margaret was devastated by the coverage. The photographs had been taken on Mustique, the one place she thought she was safe. Her sanctuary had been violated. Her privacy had been sold for newspaper profits. But she never blamed the island. She never stopped going back. If anything, the scandal made Mustique more important to her. It was the only place that was truly hers, no matter what the newspapers said. "I was just following my heart," Roddy later said of their 8-year relationship. So was Margaret. On Mustique, she had been able to follow her heart in a way she never could in London. The price of freedom. Margaret's relationship with Roddy eventually ended, as most relationships do. She never remarried. She spent her later years increasingly isolated, her circle of friends shrinking as age took its toll. Her health declined. A lifetime of smoking caught up with her. She had part of her lung removed in 1985. She suffered a mild stroke in 1998, ironically while staying at Les Jolies, Eaux. She scalded her feet badly in a bathroom accident the following year. More strokes followed. Throughout it all, she kept returning to Mustique. Twice a year, usually October and February, she would fly to the Caribbean and settle into her beloved house. Even when she could no longer walk the beaches easily, she sat on the veranda and looked out at the sea. In 1996, she made a decision that surprised many. She gave Les Jolies Eaux to her son David as a wedding present. It was partly to minimize death duties, but it was also a passing of the torch. The house that had meant so much to her would now belong to the next generation. What happened next broke her heart. David, now Viscount Linley, had inherited his father's business acumen, but not his mother's sentimentality. In 1999, just 3 years after receiving Les Jolies Eaux, he sold it. The price was £2.4 million. The buyers were an American couple with Irish connections. Margaret was reportedly devastated. The only property she had ever owned, the only place that had truly been hers, was gone. Friends said she never fully recovered from the loss. She died 3 years later, in February 2002, at King Edward VII Hospital in London. She was cremated at Slough Crematorium, an unusual choice for a royal, and her ashes were placed alongside her father's in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor Castle. The Queen Mother died 7 weeks later. The sisters, Elizabeth and Margaret, were the last surviving members of the family that had been so close during those years at Royal Lodge before the abdication changed everything. What remains? Today, Les Jolies Eaux still stands on its headland at the southern tip of Mustique. The villa has changed since Margaret's time. The new owners simplified the interior design, adding Irish cultural elements to the tropical aesthetic that Messel created. But the bones of the house remain. The coral stone balustrades, the Caribbean tiles, the view across the endless blue water. And the house is available to rent. For around $45,000 a week, anyone can stay where Princess Margaret once entertained rock stars and royalty. They can swim from the private beach. They can sit on the veranda and watch the sunset. They can imagine what it felt like to be a princess who had finally found a place where she could be herself. Mustique itself has changed too. What was once a desolate rock is now one of the most exclusive destinations in the world. The villa owners include hedge fund managers, tech billionaires, and celebrities seeking privacy. William and Catherine, the Prince and Princess of Wales, holiday there regularly. The island has come full circle, hosting a new generation of royals seeking the same escape Margaret found. Colin Tennant eventually sold his shares in the Mustique company and moved to St. Lucia, where he ran a restaurant built as a copy of one of Oliver Messel's stage sets. He died in 2010, aged 83. His title passed not to his grandson, as expected, but to his manservant Kent Adonai, in a final act of the eccentricity that had defined his life. Lady Anne Tennant, Margaret's lady-in-waiting and one of her closest friends, wrote about those years in her memoir. She remembered a Margaret who was very different from the difficult diva of tabloid legend. She remembered a friend who could be demanding, certainly, but who was also loyal, funny, and capable of great warmth. The Margaret she knew was not the tragic figure of the later newspaper profiles. She was a woman who had found moments of genuine happiness, many of them on a small Caribbean island that most of the world had never heard of. The meaning of home. What does Les Jolies Eaux tell us about Princess Margaret? Perhaps it tells us that even those born into the most extraordinary privilege can feel rootless, can feel that they don't quite belong, can spend their lives searching for a place that feels like home. Margaret's official residences were among the grandest in the world. Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Kensington Palace. She could have lived in any of them, surrounded by priceless art and centuries of history. But none of them belonged to her. All of them came with obligations, expectations, surveillance. All of them were borrowed from an institution that demanded conformity in exchange for comfort. Les Jolies Eaux was different. It was small, remote, impractical. It required bucket showers and tinned food before it was finished. It sat on an island so obscure that most atlas makers didn't bother to include it. But it was hers, bought with money that came as a gift from a friend, not an allocation from the state. Built according to her wishes, not the requirements of protocol. Filled with guests she chose, not dignitaries she was required to entertain. For a woman who had spent her entire life as the spare, the supporting player, the also-ran, that ownership meant everything, the shadow princess. There is a temptation to see Princess Margaret as a tragic figure, the woman who could have married the man she loved but chose duty instead. The sister who lived in the shadow of the most famous queen in history. The rebel who was never quite rebellious enough to break free entirely. And there is truth in that narrative. Margaret did suffer. She did make sacrifices. She did end up divorced, diminished, in public standing, increasingly irrelevant as newer, younger royals captured the public imagination. But to see her only through that lens is to miss something important. Margaret also lived. She loved, even when that love was forbidden or frowned upon. She laughed, even when the newspapers were tearing her apart. She created spaces of beauty and joy, both at Kensington Palace and at Les Jolies Eaux. She found a way to carve out moments of authentic selfhood within a system designed to suppress individuality. She built a house, quite literally, where she could be herself. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. The lessons of beautiful waters. Les Jolies Eaux means beautiful waters in French. The name came from the locals, who had always called that headland by that phrase because of the stunning views of the Caribbean and Atlantic meeting at the island's southern tip. But the name could also describe what Margaret found there. Not just beautiful waters to look at, but beautiful waters to float in, metaphorically speaking. A place of buoyancy. A place where the weight she carried could temporarily be set aside. The irony is that Margaret spent her entire life surrounded by palaces. Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Sandringham, Balmoral, Kensington Palace, Clarence House. These were among the grandest residences in the world, filled with priceless art, historical treasures, and centuries of accumulated magnificence. But none of them were hers. Every palace came with strings attached, rules about who could visit, protocols about how rooms should be used, expectations about behavior, appearances, and the constant, exhausting performance of royalty. We all need places like that, places where we can stop performing. Most of us will never own a villa on a Caribbean island. We won't have theatrical designers creating our dream homes or rock stars attending our parties. But we all need somewhere we can stop meeting expectations, stop being who others need us to be, and start being who we actually are. For Margaret, that place was 10 acres on a remote headland, a house designed by a theatrical genius, and a community of friends who valued her for something other than her title. The house became her truest expression of self. Not the grand apartment at Kensington Palace, which was still bound by government oversight and royal tradition. Not any of the official residences where she stayed as a guest of the institution she served. Just this one small villa, built to her specifications, filled with her possessions, hosting the people she chose to invite. The fact that she only owned this place for a few decades before it was sold away doesn't diminish its importance. If anything, it makes the story more poignant. She found her sanctuary. She enjoyed it while she could. And then, like so much else in her life, it slipped through her fingers. But she had it. For a time she had it. And having it changed her. A final thought. Stand on the veranda of Les Jolies Eaux today and look out at the view that Margaret loved. The Caribbean stretches endlessly toward the horizon, that particular shade of turquoise that photographs can never quite capture. The tropical gardens rustle in the trade winds, their leaves creating a constant, gentle percussion. The sounds of the island, birdsong and distant waves and the occasional call of a fisherman heading out to sea create a soundtrack of peace. This is what she saw. This is what she heard. This is where she came, twice a year for more than 2 decades, seeking something she couldn't find anywhere else. The villa has new owners now. They have made changes, as new owners always do. But the bones of the house remain what Oliver Messel designed them to be. The view remains what it has always been. The sense of remoteness, of being separated from the ordinary world, persists despite the helicopters and private jets that now bring visitors to Mustique. Was it worth it? The scandal, the divorce, the tabloid wars, the loss of public sympathy that followed the Roddy Llewellyn photographs. Was having this one place that was truly hers worth all the pain that came with claiming it? Only Margaret could answer that question, and she's not here to answer it. But she kept coming back. Through the scandals that dominated newspaper front pages, through the health crises that ravaged her body, through the strokes and the scalded feet and the failing lungs, she kept returning to Les Jolies Eaux as long as she physically could. That tells us something important. It tells us that whatever she found there, whatever peace or freedom or simple happiness that Villa offered, it mattered more to her than the cost of finding it. More than the judgment of strangers, more than the disapproval of traditionalists, more than the endless commentary about whether she was living up to royal standards. She found her place, she claimed it, she defended it, and she loved it until the very end. Princess Margaret Rose, the spare, the rebel, the homeowner, the woman who built her dream on a headland called Beautiful Waters. She spent her whole life in palaces that belonged to other people, but for a few precious decades, she had something that was hers. A house where she could be herself. A place where she could finally, truly relax. That's not a sad story. That's a triumph. Les Jolies Eaux still stands. The water is still beautiful. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirit of a princess who refused to be defined by her limitations still lingers on that veranda, looking out at the sea, finally at peace. This is the story they never told you about Princess Margaret's hidden mansion. Not a tale of tragedy, though there was tragedy. Not a chronicle of scandal, though there was scandal. But a story about a woman who found her place in the world. It just happened to be on a tiny Caribbean island that most people had never heard of. A place where even princesses could stop being princesses for a while. A place called Mustique. A house called Les Jolies Eaux. Beautiful waters. Home. End.